Some Bible scholars have claimed we can't even be sure Jesus of Nazareth existed.
And one thing we need to keep in mind is, for us, the Bible and Jesus is a very important person. In the first century, Judea was a backwater Roman province. Nothing important happened there. They sent minor officials to govern it. It really had not much consequence to the Roman Empire, and no one really knew much of what was going on in Judea. They tried to just keep it quiet. So to have any evidence of any historical figure is quite striking. In fact, Pilate, it was only recently that we had external evidence of Pilate himself, and we now know that he actually existed and the dates of his rule and things like this. So when there's a claim that, well, we don't have any evidence of Jesus, it's actually kind of what we would expect. On the other hand, we do have rather significant textual evidence of references to Jesus pretty early on from non-Christian, non-Jewish sources. So, for example, two Roman historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, who are both writing in the early 2nd century based on their research, talk about Nero, Emperor Nero, in 64, persecuting the Christians. Now, in Suetonius, it's kind of a quick reference, but in Tacitus, you have the long description that you're probably familiar with of Christians being thrown to the lions, of burning Christians, of crucifixions of Christians, that Nero wanted to pass off blame for the fire in Rome, the Great Fire, and so he blamed the Christians. So you have, within 30 years of Jesus' death, a reference to people who are followers of this Christ, and is pretty good evidence of some knowledge of this person. The second piece of evidence is from Pliny the Younger, who was a governor in Bithynia in Asia Minor after 110. And we have preserved from him a number of letters about various topics, one of which mentions the problem of the Christians, as he saw it a problem. So these Christians would gather together and they'd worship what he called Christ, and even references they'd worship Christ as a god. So you have evidence that in the early 2nd century they're worshiping this Christ as a divine being, and they're doing all the things we would expect early Christians to do. They're teaching, they're talking about the 10 Commandments, they're having a meal, they're celebrating the Lord's Supper. So granted, this is 50 years later, but it is a further reference to Christians outside the New Testament.
If the Gospels are deemed unreliable based upon this external evidence test, then our entire knowledge of the ancient world, such as Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, will crumble, because no source compares to the best attested works of antiquity, the Gospels. Dr. Randall Price is a world-renowned archaeologist, author, and college professor. Since 2002, he has served as the director of excavations at the Qumran site, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls refer to a large collection of biblical and other texts from around the time of Christ.
Whether we talk about the autographs, which are the original versions of the Bible, or the apographs, those copies made from it, we are talking about books that were scrolls originally, written on the type of materials that were available in the ancient world. These would have been leather, a type of material that would have been made from the skins of animals, or parchment, which is prepared leather, and then would have been written with ink made from soot that's mixed with vegetable gum. Now, when we look at the book of Jeremiah, chapter 36, there it describes the process of writing. And it says that Baruch, who was Jeremiah's scribe, wrote on a type of material that was then cut up by King Jehoiakim and thrown into the fire. So it had to be something easily cut and that was burned. We believe that the material that was used more frequently was something called papyrus, made of the plant matter, originally from Egypt, but then also available in Israel itself. And this would have been extremely delicate, wouldn't have been preserved well, would have been easily to write upon, and probably the most common thing used for the composition of biblical books.
Job is an interesting book, likely the oldest book in the Bible, written about 1500 BC. The last book of the Old Testament to be written was likely the book of Malachi, which was written somewhere around 400 BC. During those 1100 years, these documents had to be copied over and over to preserve the content. Just how was that copying done to ensure accuracy? Joel Lamb, manager and curator of the Bible Museum in Goodyear, Arizona.
Skeptics have pointed out that the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament date some 1,500 years after the original writing. They assume that given the great amount of time between the original document and the oldest copy, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of errors on the text of the Old Testament. We don't know the exact process used during the Old Testament period for preserving the scriptures. However, it is important to understand that the copying methods used and reproduced in the Bible were astounding in their accuracy. The Hebrew word for scribe is sofer. Its root meaning is to count. And what did they count? We know that around the 7th century, a group of scribes called the Masoretes had to copy the original page with such exactness that the number of words on a page could not be changed. If the original page had 288 words, for instance, then the page being copied had to have the same 288 words. Each line on a new page had to be the exact same as the line on the old page. If the first line on the original page had 9 words, the first line of the copy page had to have 9 words. After a page was copied, the number of letters on that page was counted and compared with the original, and then another scribe would check to see what the middle letter was on the copy and the original. The scribes were not allowed to copy sentence for sentence or even word for word. They had to copy letter for letter. After a page was copied and checked by another, still a third person would check to see what the middle word was on the page. Then, when the whole book was finished, another would count the phrases.
And just how accurate were they in copying the Old Testament books? Up until about 65 years ago, the oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament came from around 1000 AD. These were called the Masoretic texts. They were the product of a group of Jewish scholars known as the Masoretes. They took on the responsibility to ensure that the books of the Old Testament were preserved for future generations. But how accurate was the Masoretic text? Many scholars suspected many errors had occurred in the copying process. Many people believed them until one day in 1947, a boy threw a rock into a cave.
That rock struck pottery, about 37 jars from the testimony of that particular Bedouin shepherd. And in those jars were scrolls made of parchment. On the scrolls were written copies of the Bible. Every book of the Old Testament, except for the book of Esther, was represented among those scrolls. And then also other documents, sectarian documents, but many of these were commentaries on the Bible, so included biblical text as well. What is interesting is that from one of those caves, and there were 11 caves numbered in the order of their discovery, from cave 1 came copies of the book of Isaiah. In fact, a complete copy of Isaiah, the longest book in the Old Testament, 66 chapters, the best to compare perhaps with the Masoretic text to determine how well the text had been transmitted. And in that text, we realized that 95% of that text aligned with or agreed with the Masoretic text, written over 1,000 years later. So we saw in that text the accuracy of transmission by those Hebrew scribes over that long period of time.
The Dead Sea Scrolls have been called the most important biblical archaeological find in history. While they are called scrolls, what they mostly consist of is 19,000 fragments. Putting them back together would require some of the most sophisticated science available.
Well, Dr. Meyer, what I have here is an original biblical Dead Sea Scroll fragment from Cave 4 at Qumran. And what I'm about to show you here, very few people outside of Jerusalem ever get the opportunity to hold, study, examine with their own eyes an original, on sheepskin, biblical Dead Sea Scroll fragment. That's from the book of Daniel. It dates to 125 BC.
Oh, fabulous.
Now remember, as we've taught already, the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't really scrolls. That's a misnomer, because very few complete scrolls were actually found.
The great discovery came in over 19,000 pieces that have taken literally 60 years to put back together again into the 800 or so scrolls that we know today. Now, to help understand a little bit about the science and academia of this particular project, here in my hand is a fragment of a Torah scroll from the book of Leviticus. And as you can see, 2 columns, as you were mentioning before, stitched together. And if we were to be on the reconstruction process, and this is just 350 years old, sheepskin as well, as we were putting the scrolls back together again in Jerusalem, what we would have to do is find where that particular piece went in the text.
What a puzzle, right?
And we would literally put it back together again on where it was supposed to go. There were numerous copies of the exact same scroll. For instance, 36 copies of Psalms. So how were we able to put the scrolls back together again? 3 unique techniques have been the choices there. Handwriting style. Very unique handwriting styles to some of the scribes. And because of infrared technology, we were able to line the piece up where it was supposed to go. Now, Dr. Meyer, here is an example of the technology that was used in Jerusalem in the reconstruction process. Here is how things look to the naked eye. However, when we switch things over to the infrared, look how clear that text becomes.
Fascinating.
But how, because of the duplicate copies, were we able to make sure that piece went into the right spot? Well, remember, just like humans, animals have unique DNA. Therefore, all we had to do to make sure the right spot, when the right piece went into the right spot, we would then DNA test pieces to the north, west, east, and south, and if they all matched the same DNA, we knew we put the scrolls back together again. Literally, what's taken over 60 years to perfect and to publish accurate data out of Jerusalem literally has taken that long for only one reason: making sure that we put the project back together again accurately. But this is just a wonderful little piece, and again, a perfect representation of what the Dead Sea Scrolls truly were. 19,000 pieces put back together again into over 800 unique scrolls.
Some Bible scholars have claimed we can't even be sure Jesus of Nazareth existed.
I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind is, for us, the Bible and